Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you today and to thank you for taking the time to join us for this webinar on troubleshooting the practical challenges of intercropping. To introduce myself briefly, I am Jen Banfield-Zanin. I work at Stockbridge Technology Centre in Cawood, North Yorkshire. I'm also co-lead on the on-farm validation trials work package within the DIVERSify project, which has funded the work programme that informs today's webinar. A quick bit of housekeeping. If we could ask you to please keep your microphones on mute to avoid feedback, we'd appreciate it. The webinar is being recorded, so if you don't want to appear, please keep your video off. You can also get in touch with us if you have any concerns about this or if you want more information. I'll start proceedings and give you a brief introduction to the DIVERSify project with some context. Then a bit of background on the work programme that's been going on since the start of the project, looking at barriers to uptake and potential solutions for, specifically, some of the practical challenges identified. I'll then be handing over to David, George and our panellists, who will be looking at these in more detail. There will be a 20-minute break between the two main sessions for tea acquisition. There is no need to log out of the meeting for this, but do check that your video and microphone are turned off. So, the overarching aim of DIVERSify is to develop a novel system for sustainable food production. We're looking to do this by optimizing crop species mixtures to improve stability of yield, to reduce pest and disease damage, and enhance stress resilience. The consortium is built of 24 partners in countries spanning diverse pedoclimatic zones across Europe as well as further afield. We have also engaged with commercial farmers across Europe in a participatory approach, and they have run over 40 large-scale trials looking at commercial intercropping on their own farms, then returning data from these to the project. The project approach has been to work with stakeholders from the onset in order to identify innovations and best practice for plant teams and to encourage knowledge exchange and communication between practitioners, scientists, and other stakeholders. We have used ecological approaches to identify crop traits and mechanisms that optimize plant team performance. Tested these in small-scale trials assessing different mixtures, different input regimes, and different sowing ratios. And this data has fed into modeling approaches which, among other things, might be used to predict which traits or regimes work best under different conditions, say, for example, changing climate scenarios. Another important approach has been to conduct on-farm trials, both on research farms and with the participatory farmers, to validate plant teams across Europe. In these trials, mixtures have been tested at larger scales, quantifying effects on, for example, yield, weeds, pest and disease incidence, soil quality, at a farm-relevant scale. Please note this is not an exhaustive list, but it does give some flavor of the things we looked at. There has been a lot of work on pulling together all the information and all the data into usable data frames that can be applied in useful ways. For example, they underpin production of a decision aid to support practitioners in selection of suitable plant teams for their specific local conditions. So, why the interest in intercropping? What are some of the potential benefits when the system works? First off, species-rich systems can have higher productivity than monocultures. There are a number of different mechanisms which can explain why this is. Plants might, for example, derive benefits from their neighbors. They can end up over-yielding or produce more in mixtures in the same proportional area as if they were grown by themselves. It's a very interesting area of work, not the point of today, so I'm going to leave it there. Weed biomass is often reported as being reduced. Pest populations can be directly regulated by changing the crop apparency, and a greater diversity and complexity of resources can also support natural enemies of these pests, which in turn also help to reduce pest numbers and damage. Decreased host availability, microclimate effects, changes to dispersal patterns can all reduce establishment and spread of not just pests, but also plant diseases. Intercropping can help improve or support soil health and fertility, not just in terms of nutrients or organic matter, but also in improvements to soil structure. And of course, the greater diversity of plant species can support greater levels of on-farm biodiversity, supporting both pollinators as well as the pest natural enemies mentioned a moment ago. This can, in turn, play a role in helping to meet broader agrobiodiversity policy goals, please excuse me. Intercrops can also play a role in helping to reduce agricultural inputs. For example, when you're growing with nitrogen-fixing legumes, some of the nitrogen input comes directly from your plant team, so less nitrogen needs to be applied. As well as being an environmental gain, of course, less reliance on nitrogen fertilizers can help buffer gross margins against price changes for nitrogen inputs. Reduced weeds, pests, and diseases also mean fewer agrochemical inputs. Also important is the ability of species-rich systems to buffer against environmental fluctuations, increasing overall system resilience to stresses such as climate change, as well as market pressures. And using plant mixtures also provides opportunities to diversify cropping and income and to generate innovation further along the value chain. All sounds good. Of course, there are reasons why it is not as widespread in conventional production, despite the potential benefits. And there are important practical questions that still need resolving, or at least addressing, to ensure commercial viability across the spectrum of agricultural production. Modern agriculture is geared towards homogeneous monocultures. There are, unsurprisingly, added complexities to consider when dealing with mixed plant teams. First off, which species work well in a team? Current breeding focuses on performance in monoculture, so then which cultures, which traits perform best within a plant team? What ratios should we be sowing at to ensure we get the best performance? What happens around crop maturity? This, of course, affects harvest. Existing input programs are another challenge. These are not necessarily suited to intercropping, so what changes need to be made to optimize agronomic approaches and production systems for plant mixtures? How do we successfully navigate balancing out obtaining decent yield with gross margins and with other benefits that we might be specifically interested in on a case-by-case basis? What do we do if, for example, weeds do get in and get a good foothold? How do we control them? What management options are effective? And of course, fundamentally, what kit is available to help us operate in intercropping? What kit might we be able to adapt to suit the needs of plant mixtures rather than those of a monoculture? What's in development? And this, of course, goes beyond management in the field. It also goes further down the production chain into processing, for example, and seed separation. DIVERSify has looked at addressing some of these questions. At the start of the project, between 2017 and 2018, we ran a series of 15 stakeholder workshops across 11 different countries, the aim of which was to learn from farmers what their on-farm experiences were. It was also an opportunity to identify a broad range of barriers and to learn from stakeholders whether they thought these were perceived or real barriers in each of the regions that ran a workshop. We then narrowed down on what the practical barriers were, as opposed to, say, policy ones, and started to look at these in greater detail. Again, our consortium and, most importantly, our participatory farmer network also fed in their own experiences and any difficulties they noted in growing their mixtures previously or also in the trials over the course of the project. We then started work on identifying solutions to these practical challenges. We were broadly able to categorize barriers as relating to drilling, agronomy, harvest, and others, broad I know. I won't go into too great a detail here, as Dave will be covering this in a minute. We used these to discuss known or possible solutions with PAT providers, with machinery manufacturers, and with other industry stakeholders in one-to-one meetings, at agri-tech industry events, as well as through direct canvassing of our project partners and the participatory farmer network. This gave us over 50 individual contacts, resulting in over 40 general and specific PAT machinery and product solutions to intercropping barriers being identified. These have been collated and formed into solutions matrices with further refinement within barrier categories, taking into account accessibility levels and plant team structures, as well as highlighting potential market gaps. The details here form the meat of the webinar, so now it's my turn to thank you for listening. I'll thank my colleagues at the James Hutton Institute for letting me use some of their graphs and images, and I will now hand you over to Dave for the interesting part of the afternoon. Thank you very much.